Welcome to the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility, an ongoing inquiry into American political origins and evolving institutions. The Executive Director of the Virtual Center is Dr. Bill O'Brien. He's also your host for this ongoing conversation. Here he is now, Dr. Bill O'Brien.
And welcome to the third edition of the Virtual Center for the Study of the U.S. Constitution and Civic Responsibility this week. Today is Wednesday. It is the 27th day of August. It is a pleasure to be with you once again for our full period today, two full hours today. This is our final program of the week, and we'll be continuing the same theme that we've been looking at both Monday and yesterday. Which is the whole issue of the extent to which concerns about class warfare are a factor in the drafting and the ratification of the Constitution of the United States. Again, we are not, in no way am I trying to suggest that everybody needs to forego and abandon everything that we knew before. I'm not saying that. But it's pretty obvious that these particular issues that we've been focusing on for the last 2 days, and we will continue to focus on today, are important considerations. And the reason I say that, and the reason these programs are, I believe, so significant, is because this is material that has pretty much been overlooked, ignored, or suppressed, if you want to be crude about it. I'll be honest, I don't necessarily believe that there are that many people who really grasp the full ramifications of what we've got here. I think that that people would be shocked to be confronted with some of the source materials available during the Constitutional Convention and during the struggle for ratification of that Constitution. I believe the letter that we have here, written in 1829 by James Madison toward the end of his life, when he's an elderly man, I think is one of the most significant and insightful and important pieces of historical evidence that I've had in my hands for a long time. We would love to hear from you. I especially solicit your input on this stuff because it is so controversial. I think it is so important to get this out there for a number of reasons. And I would love to hear from you. Again, Bob Kincaid, in his introduction to the program, refers to the Virtual Center as an ongoing conversation. That is the goal. But again, that requires some interaction. And I would love to hear from you. We have a phone number that is reserved just for that purpose. We would love to hear from you. More than just me is interested. More than, I'm interested in what you have to say, of course. But I think our other listeners would be equally interested to get a sense as to what you think, because I'm sure all of them are reflecting upon this information for themselves, and they're drawing their own conclusions. I think they would like to hear other people's conclusions as well. Our phone number is area code 304-574-8178. That's 304-574-8178. If you'd like to communicate directly with me via email, then please feel free to use my email address, waobrien906@gmail.com. That's waobrien906@gmail.com. For those of you who were with us yesterday, you do recall that we spent the entire program yesterday, even though it was an abbreviated program. We started a half hour late, as we do every Tuesday. But we spent the entire program on Madison's 1829 letter. And that particular letter was cited at the end of the programs last week when we were talking about Madison's projections as to the growth of population in America and what that might mean in terms of the need to alter and adapt the political structure to the changing circumstances. And I made reference yesterday, Bob Kincaid made reference as well, to the fact that the more we think about this, the more we begin to recognize that here's James Madison, the so-called father of the Constitution, acknowledging that in order to survive, the Constitution of the United States must be a living document. It must be able to adjust to change in order to survive. Madison believes, as we know from his notes on the state of Virginia, Jefferson believed also that the strength and stability and security of this nation in the 18th century was to a significant degree determined by the extent to which the nation remained agricultural. As long as we became and remained a nation of yeoman farmers, independent farmers who worked their own property, we would remain a stable, secure society in which individual freedom would not only be possible, but would remain a priority. But Jefferson's concern, as reflected in his administration when he was president, Jefferson's concern was that we had to do everything we could do in this country to avoid the creation of large urban areas, huge cities, where we would attract increasing numbers of low-paid and unemployed, propertyless people. Those, Jefferson believed, if you look at European history, those are the seeds of revolution. That's where dissent and revolution originates. In cities, when you have large numbers of people that don't have a vested interest in preserving the status quo. Jefferson believed this was in part behind his absolute determination to purchase Louisiana from France when Napoleon made it available for $15 million in 1803. Jefferson believed that the securing of Louisiana, which encompassed more than well over half of the continental United States, guaranteed the peace and security and the stability of the American Republic for generations to come. It's obvious from this letter, written in 1829, when he was already an old man. Jefferson and John Adams had both died 3 years earlier in 1826 on July 4th, as we know. Madison, obviously, in this letter, is in total agreement with Jefferson on the issue of population. And he makes these incredible projections as to the growth of population in the United States, and he anticipates that in about 100 years from 1829, which would be ironically 1929, which is the market crash and the beginning of our Great Depression, ironically, Madison believes that by that time the population of the United States will have reached 192 million. Going back, Bob Kincaid went back to the census of 1960 and discovered that in the census of 1960, the population of this country was given as 189 million. So Madison was off by 3 million and 30 years. It's incredible. But in the letter we looked at yesterday, Madison is speculating on the fact that the Republic as we know it in the 18th century, the Republic as we know it can last only as long as there is sufficient property to make it possible for the vast majority of Americans to become property owners, to develop a vested interest or a stake in society as a property owner. But by 1829, Madison is already witnessing the increase in population in some urban areas in America and the extent to which these urban areas are being populated by people who have been forced to accept low-paying jobs, people who live from paycheck to paycheck, people who do not and cannot expect to ever own property. At the time, in 1829, a major political reform underway in this country was the expansion of the suffrage, the right to vote, to heads of household and heads of families. In other words, property qualifications, which had been the defining factor in who could vote and who couldn't during the colonial period and through the 18th century, property qualifications were being abandoned as state after state was lowering the requirements for the right to vote, until by 1829 the nation was experiencing an expansion of the suffrage to all those who were heads of family and heads of households. And in this letter, Madison is justifying that. He's justifying that as the kind of change that is necessary in order to preserve the republic in the face of changing demographics, which is an increase in the number of underemployed and unemployed, propertyless citizens. Madison believes and says very clearly that extending these people the right to participate in the political process is absolutely vital if these people are going to really feel that they are part of this nation, that they are part of the American national nation or the American community. Madison believes, and we all recognize, it seems to me, that the stability of any nation, especially a republic, especially a popular government that puts a premium on individual freedom, is a nation which must do everything that it can do to make it possible for people to be included, to feel included, to acquire property. That's no question. That's why throughout our history, government has been vigilant in making certain that people can buy property and hold on to property, which is why during the recent recession, the foreclosure craze that's been going on is very, very dangerous to America's social fabric. It's very dangerous politically because people are being driven out of the property market. People are being driven from their own homes. It is absolutely vital in order to preserve the security and the peace and the stability of this society that everybody must feel included. Therefore, government must do everything it can do to short circuit this inclination on the part of the private sector to foreclose on mortgages that are in arrears. That's why programs, government programs like the VA program, the Veterans Program after World War II, and the creation of the Federal Home Loan Association, and the extent to which people's bank accounts and people's homes are secured and insured. Because home ownership and a feeling of that we all have skin in the game, that we all have vested in this society, is what makes this society go. So Madison, consequently, is endorsing and supporting the expansion of the suffrage during this period, 1829, to the heads of households and the heads of families. Because he points out in a republic where the demographics are changing so rapidly and the population is increasing so rapidly, it's pretty evident to Madison that if you look down the road This nation is going to have to make significant changes in the way it is governed in order to preserve the nature of popular government, the republic itself. Madison predicts in this letter that within 100 years the population will have reached 192 million people. At that point, Madison believes a major change in the way we govern this society is going to have to be made. And as we saw day before yesterday, on Monday, in a number of the quotations that we looked at, a number of delegates at the Constitutional Convention were saying the same thing. At some point in time, this nation's going to have to turn to a monarchy. We're going to have a king of some sort. We're going to have some sort of a strong central government that is more powerful than either the property owners or the property-less. Because there's no question that those two groups are going to be at each other constantly. There's got to be a power over them in order to maintain peace and in order to manage that competition. Because if we don't, we will have class warfare, civil war in this society based on the widening gap between the few who have and the many who don't. I think this is one of the most powerful letters that I've seen in a long time from this early period of American history. It is a classic statement as to what is necessary in order to preserve the concept of community in America, given our political system, given our commitment to individual freedom, given our commitment to a Republican form of government and the values and ideals associated with that. Educated citizenry, the ability to participate, the ability to select your representatives, every reason in the world to believe that your representatives are listening to you, that you have a voice, that you are heard, that what you believe and what you think matters, and all of these other things that we take for granted in this society. All of it is contingent on having the bulk of our citizens feel that they are included. That's one of the reasons why the issue of race has been such a volatile issue throughout American history. Not only was race a key factor in the Civil War, but race has remained a key factor ever since then, because very honestly, this nation has never quite been able to figure out how to achieve the ideals that this nation was founded upon. If you believe that this is not still a struggle, I would just remind you of the turmoil that we have been witnessing on television over the last couple of the weeks in Ferguson, Missouri. The extent to which race is a factor in the way police officers police and the way citizens respond. I've heard, I know you had over the years, many prominent African American spokesmen in this country, journalists. I'm thinking of Gene Robinson, specifically of the Washington Post, who I heard say this more than one time, that African Americans, in rearing their children, especially their male children, always make it a point to teach them to be very careful and expect to be stopped and frisked and everything else on the streets of American cities, because that's the way it is. We've never quite been able to get our arms around and handle successfully this problem. It is divisive. It is potentially divisive. It is potentially destructive of the nature of the community, the social fabric in our entire society. We have got to address it, and we have got to deal with it. And part of it is to recognize that in a popular government, which puts a premium on individual freedom and limited government, it is absolutely vital that people feel included, and that we do everything that we can do to prevent a sense from developing among any group of people in this society that they are excluded and that they are treated less than equally to everybody else. And that's what Madison is talking about in this letter. It is one of the most, I think, one of the most significant pieces of historical evidence that I've been exposed to in a long time. There was one more major paragraph to this letter of Madison's. You may remember that when we finished yesterday, we had a conversation going. Bob Kincaid got on the air, and we were batting back and forth. I talked to my brother last night, who made a point that he feels that Bob's contribution and the interaction is very, very helpful in understanding this, because Bob seems to have a way of zeroing right in on the key issues to make sure that everybody, when everybody leaves, they leave with the right information in the right order, as it were. Madison gives us projections of 192 million, and then he talks about. Well, I think this is where we talked about. This is where we finished yesterday in terms of Madison's letter. Madison points out that there will be a gradual decrease in the ratio of this increase of population, but as long as agriculture continues to yield its abundance, the decrease or the change in the ratio, the growth of the population, will remain rather minor. In other words, there'll be a decrease. The rate of increase may not be quite as large, but all of that will be affected by the extent to which agriculture is able to support a growing population of non-farm people. Madison points out that Great Britain has doubled her population, Madison says, in 1829, in the last 50 years, which from 1829 would have been from 1780 to 1829. So in that 50-year period from 1780, from the period of American independence, as it were, up into the third decade of the 19th century, Great Britain's population doubled, notwithstanding its amount in proportion to its territory at the commencement of that period. In other words, Madison is pointing out that we have to remember that Great Britain's an island, and it cannot sustain population growth like that for too long, given the fact that it is an island. And then Madison makes reference to Ireland. And he said, Ireland is a much stronger proof of the effect of an increasing product of food in multiplying consumers. We know that in the mid-19th century, in the early 19th century, Ireland is going to experience a horrendous famine. It begins in the late 18th century. If you read Benjamin Franklin's papers, Benjamin Franklin is appalled at the way he sees people being forced to live in Ireland because there's inadequate food. Properties enclosed. People's access to sustenance is limited, which, again, drives many Irish citizens to embark on the overseas trek to the United States. So in the early 19th century, Irish immigrants tend to populate and to produce tremendous increase in America's cities: Boston, Philadelphia, Providence, New York, Baltimore, Philadelphia, and on and on and on. This is the paragraph that I was referring to earlier, because Madison writes in a way which makes it very difficult to grasp precisely what he's saying. So I encourage you to let's reason together. Let's reflect upon this one together. So first, let me read it. Madison says, how far this view of the subject will be affected by the Republican laws of descent and distribution in equalizing the property of the citizens and in reducing to a minimum mutual surpluses for mutual supplies cannot be inferred from any direct and adequate experiment, period. Very, very complicated, difficult sentence. What Madison seems to be saying is that, by definition, a republic must have laws which manage or seek to manage or regulate the distribution, the laws of inheritance, the laws of descent, and the laws of distribution of property. Laws that, as Madison says, result in equalizing the property of citizens and reducing the minimum mutual surpluses for mutual supplies. What he's saying is this is a very vague, this is a crapshoot. It's very hard to be precise. But in order to preserve stability, community, in a republic, its laws must do everything that they can do to manage and make more equitable the distribution of property and access to property. One result of this, Madison says, one result would seem to be a deficiency of the capital for the expensive establishments which facilitate labor and cheapen its products on the one hand, and on the other, of the capacity to purchase the costly and ornamental articles consumed by the wealthy alone, who must cease to be idlers and become laborers. Period. This is totally my interpretation. I would love to hear yours. In that sentence, Madison seems to me to be saying that in a republic, the need to manage the distribution of property and the descent of property in such a way in order to preserve the stability and order of society, in order to preserve the republic itself, one must face reality. And that reality is a deficiency or a decline in the capital available for ostentatious living by the wealthy. He says, one result would seem to be a deficiency of the capital for the expensive establishments which facilitate labor and cheapen its products on the one hand, and on the other, of the capacity to purchase the costly and ornamental articles consumed by the wealthy alone, who must be idlers and must become laborers. Madison is saying that in a republic must accomplish, they must provide for the kind of in economic expansion that facilitate labor, in other words, create jobs, and at the same time cheapen the products, in other words, make available to as many people as possible items and goods that only used to be available to the few. In other words, the access to the good life, access to goods and services that only used to be available to the few, must be available to a wide range of your community. That's one thing that these laws of distribution and descent must do. The other thing they must do is they must minimize the purchase of costly ornamental articles that only the wealthy ever buy and can buy. These people must appear to become laborers and cease to be just idlers. How they live, what they buy, whether in fact they flaunt their wealth or not, Madison seems to be saying all of that has a direct bearing on the stability and the security of the republic. There's no question that one reason that this is so significant, if you jump to today, is because we are being confronted, we are being bombarded with all sorts of evidence to suggest a tremendous increase in wealth, in the gap between the rich and the poor in this country. Inequality is greater in this country than it's ever been before. Inequality is greater in this country than it is in any other industrialized, developed country on the face of the earth. We are in for trouble, Madison would say, based on what he's written here. Madison goes on in that same paragraph. Another outcome, another result, he says, the increased mass of laborers added to the production of necessaries by the withdrawal for this object of a part of those now employed in producing luxuries, and the addition to the laborers from the class of present consumers of luxuries. In other words, what we're looking at here, ideally, is a redistribution of work in this country in such a way that the people who are doing well demonstrate a willingness to work for it. It doesn't mean that everybody has to have the same amount. We're not talking socialism here. We're talking access to wealth, access to jobs, access to living wages. All of these things, Madison is saying, requires a change in the relative demographics and makeup of society as it develops in the 19th century. Madison obviously already is beginning to see early in the 19th century the growth of cities and the increase of larger and larger numbers of propertyless working poor people in this country. We haven't even dealt with what's going to happen in this nation after we abolish slavery 30 years later in 1860. That produces civil war. To the effect of these changes, this is really significant. Madison says, to the effect of these changes, intellectual, moral, and social, the institutions and the laws of the country must be adapted, and it will require for the task all the wisdom of the wisest patriots. What Madison seems to be saying in that last sentence is this is really delicate. We are going to have shrewd, sharp, patriotic, committed leaders who understand how volatile and how sensitive these issues are. They have a moral component. They have a social component. They have an intellectual component. The institution and the laws of this country must be adapted in such a way that we are able to address and deal with the changing demographics of this nation, or the republic will not survive. I think that this is one of the most important letters that I have ever read from one of the founders. I think it is incredibly insightful. I think it's incredibly important. And I think it serves to contradict all of those people that would try to appropriate or to claim Madison, his Federalist number 10, his Constitution, for themselves as protecting the ideal of individual freedom, competition, and government's number one priority of protecting private property. Government's number one priority is to deal with and to govern, is to secure the public interest. The public interest is a peaceful, secure society in which everybody feels that they are important and they have a part to play and they are welcome and they are treated equally and they are treated with respect. That's the public interest. That's what our political system is about. That's what the ideals and the vision and the goals of the founders were. I think we really need to begin to rethink some of the assumptions and misapplications of information that we've been exposed to over the years. And then finally, Madison closes his letter with this, which I think kind of pulls together the whole idea of the projections, the statistical analysis on population growth that he's done. Madison said, supposing the estimate of the growing population of the United States to be nearly correct, In other words, he says, let's assume, for purposes of discussion, that what I've said probably will happen, will happen. Let's assume that. Let's assume that I've been correct. And the extent of their territory to be 8 or 900 millions of acres. In other words, let's assume that we're talking about the entire continental United States here. And 1/4 of that to consist of arable surface. In other words, at least 1/4 of the available land will be conducive to farming, to agriculture. There will, he says, all of these things being true, there will in a century or a little more than a century be nearly as crowded a population in the United States as in Great Britain or France. And if the present Constitution, with all of its flaws, has lasted more than half a century, it is not an unreasonable hope that an amended one will last more than a century. If these observations be just, every mind will be able to develop and apply them. So what Madison says at the very end is, if you assume my numbers to be correct, my projections to be correct, then in about 100 years or a little bit more, America will be facing the same kind of demographic challenge that Great Britain is currently facing at that time. And the Constitution, the republic that we have, will have to adapt, James Madison is saying. So what Madison is saying is that the Constitution of the United States, which he designed, the Virginia Plan, was appropriate for the nation as it existed at that time. But Madison is also saying that he recognizes that as change happens and as population grows and as more and more of the population is not farming but is in manufacturing, then the republic, the Constitution, will have to adapt to these changes if it is going to survive. I would suggest to you that James Madison himself has answered Antonin Scalia about originalism in the Constitution of the United States. Madison himself is saying the system that we have put together will work at best for 100 years. And then we better be ready to adapt it. Because if we don't, we're going to lose it. I would suggest to you that many people right now, given the kinds of things that are happening in this country and around the world, many people cynically are beginning to look at what's going on, look at the evening news today, and are beginning to say to themselves, maybe this is the beginning of the end. Maybe this is a recreation of the fall of Rome. I mean, how many times have we heard that? I think that what we have done here at the Virtual Center, and we are just beyond the first half hour of our program today, I think that what we have seen in Madison's letter is that James Madison himself has appeared before the Supreme Court of the United States, specifically before Antonin Scalia, and if he was still alive, Robert Bork, who was the first spokesman for the idea of originalism in interpreting the Constitution, and suggesting that the man who wrote it acknowledges that it must adapt. We must be willing to adapt it to changing circumstances. What Madison is suggesting, I believe, is that the only way that this nation is going to survive is with government from dedicated, visionary, committed, progressive individuals who are willing to put aside their own self-interest and constantly focus on the public interest and the preservation of the community, of the nation as a whole. Those are the kinds of people we better elect. I would suggest to you this says a lot about the coming elections this fall. It says a lot about the Tea Party. It says a lot about the Koch brothers. It says a lot about the right and the efforts to reform through a second convention, the Constitution of the United States, to try to take us back to the Confederation period. I would suggest to you we better be very, very vigilant. I think that this is an unbelievable letter. I hope you agree. We've devoted a lot of time here at the Virtual Center to this particular letter. And I invite you to go online yourself and get a copy of it. In Google, under search, just type in James Madison projections on population growth. And you will get selection from the Madison Papers, Chapter 16, which is Madison's Thinking on Suffrage, written in 1829, from the Madison Papers, Volume 4, pages 28 to 30. I think every American ought to have a copy of this particular letter. All of this is part of the theme that we talked about at the beginning of Monday's program this week, which is the extent to which what many people refer to as class warfare, the conflict between the poor and the wealthy, between those with property and those without property, was a consideration, a major consideration at the Constitutional Convention in terms of the way the Constitution was drafted, and a major consideration in the minds of those who voted to ratify it. We looked, if you remember, a few days ago at a number of quotes from Gouverneur Morris, from Benjamin Franklin, from Hugh Williamson in North Carolina. We looked at statement after statement which indicated that many of the delegates at the Constitutional Convention believed that at some point in time we were going to need a king. But in the interim, we could have a republic provided the political system we create is as stable as possible. That was Hamilton's speech on June 18th. We've got to create, at that point, he was making to the convention an argument pointing out that neither the Virginia plan nor the New Jersey plan, he felt, was strong enough to be successful. Consequently, he gave us his own plan. I want to share with you another source we have consistently talked about here throughout the life of the Virtual Center, the 17 months or so that we've been on, that what we know about the Constitutional Convention is pretty much because of the notes, the extensive, copious notes that James Madison took of every session. Madison never missed the convention. He was there every day. He took notes. What we know about what happened and who spoke about what are thanks to Madison's notes. But we must also remember that James Madison is a human being. He is not a machine. He's not a computer. He's a human being. He's a politician. He's a Virginian. He has an agenda. He has his own druthers. There's certain things he wants and certain things he doesn't want. One of the reason, what I'm getting to here, is one of the most, it's rarely spoken about. But very early in the convention, if you remember, the convention was due to convene on the 14th of May. But actually, it took another week and a half before they had enough people to form a quorum to actually open the convention and appoint Washington as president of the convention. So the convention didn't really start in earnest until late in May of 1787. On the 29th of May, which is very early in the convention, Charles Pinckney of South Carolina proposes his own version of a constitution. This is right after the opening of the Congress, the opening of the Constitutional Convention. It's right after Edmund Randolph introduces the Virginia Plan, Madison's plan. This is Pinckney's plan. And one of the things that historians have been dealing with is the fact that Madison's notes are very, very sketchy and very, very skimpy on Pinckney's plan. It's very obvious to most historians that Madison wanted his plan to be the focus of discussion and debate at the convention. Therefore, he wasn't open to an alternative plan proposed by Pinckney, which, and I have a copy of it. If you read it, it's very similar to the Virginia Plan in a lot of ways. But ironically, it's quite similar as well to Hamilton's program as he lays it out on the 18th of June. Pinckney's talking about a strong government with a council of revision, the right of the Congress and the Senate together to oversee and, if necessary, veto state laws. And Pinckney's, the point I'm trying to make is Pinckney's plan is difficult to get a hold of because, in depending on Madison's notes, Madison doesn't give Pinckney's plan anywhere near the attention or the space that it would seem to warrant. The reason I introduce this at all is because what it says to me is that Madison was not receptive to Pinckney's plan. The Virginia Plan was already on the table, and that was the way Madison wanted it. That's what the plans were, and so therefore he mentions the fact that Pinckney introduced the plan, but he doesn't say what it was. But because some notes were taken by others, Robert Yates of New York, for example, Pinckney's plan is laid out there in some detail, but it's not in Madison's notes, and I think we need to acknowledge that. And then, of course, on the 18th of June, in a 6-hour speech, Hamilton takes the floor and introduces the plan, which we looked at here at the Virtual Center a few weeks ago. We've been talking about the theme, or the extent to which the fear or the threat of class warfare in America was a factor. And if you remember on Monday, and again yesterday as well, we looked at Hamilton's Federalist number 9 when Hamilton talked about the strong union as being a safeguard against domestic faction and insurrection. And then, of course, the next Federalist paper is number 10, written by Madison, and that's the one that gets all the attention. I think the one thing you will note between number 9 and number 10, between Hamilton's effort to deal with faction and Madison's effort to deal with faction, a major difference, it seems to me, is that Hamilton's strategy for addressing the problems of faction is to create a government strong enough to control them. Madison's approach in number 10, acknowledging that factions are sown in the nature of man, is to create a system of internal checks and balances which makes the majority faction unable to organize and execute its plans of oppression. That's a quote from Federalist number 10. So in other words, Hamilton relies principally on the power of government to manage and control factions. Madison believes that if you create the proper system internally, you make it impossible for factions ever to surface and become functional. So in other words, Madison develops a systemic way of addressing the problem of faction. Hamilton is looking specifically, clearly, at a top-down, creating a government with enough power to address whatever challenges factions might create. But again, we looked at the first paragraph of Hamilton's Federalist Number 9, and without reading the entire sentence paragraph again, you will remember that Hamilton was talking about the peace and stability of the states in order to serve as a barrier against domestic faction and insurrection. And I'm just running through this paragraph, identifying the language, the words that Hamilton uses. The theme here is, without question, domestic factions and insurrection. Feeling sensations of horror and disgust at the distractions with which republics have always been continually agitated and exposed to a rapid succession of revolutions, constantly buffeted between the extremes of tyranny and anarchy, furious storms that come to republics, sedition, party rage, tempestuous waves of sedition, the vices of government. In other words, there's no question that if you pull all these words out, all these adjectives out, you begin to get a sense that Hamilton is opening Federalist Number 9 by laying out clearly why republics must take into consideration domestic factions and the insurrections which they create. And we looked at his Federalist Number, we looked at the first part of Federalist Number 9. We haven't looked at the entire document yet because I think the second half of this is an effort to take on Montesquieu, and I think that's a separate program. But I wanted to share with you something else. You'll remember a few weeks ago that we looked at Madison's notes on Hamilton's speech of June 18th, 1787. And we went through Madison's notes, and there's quite a bit in them. Madison's notes on Hamilton's speech are pretty complete, but they are not totally complete. And it so happens that one of Hamilton's fellow delegates from the state of New York, Robert Yates, took notes on Hamilton's speech as well. And if you look at Yates's notes on Hamilton's speech, he says some things that about what Hamilton is saying that Madison doesn't say. And so I think that you can get a better, more of a flavor, if you will, of Hamilton's concern about the fate of the Republic by reading Yates's account of his speech than by reading Madison's account of his speech, if that makes sense. So what I would like to do, and we're moving towards the top of our first hour, it's 54 minutes after the hour. What I would like to do at the beginning of our second hour today is share with you that portion of Madison's notes in which he creates the portion of Hamilton's speech addressing domestic factions, the issue of class warfare, the issue of finding ways to preserve the Republic in the face of a changing nation that is going to be forced to confront the realities of a larger and larger population of non-farming people. Consequently, a political republic that must be willing to adapt to the demographic realities that the nation is sure to face. There's no question that in Federalist number 9, Hamilton is laying out to the voters of New York why they should support the Constitution of the United States, because the Constitution of the United States promises a way to deal with the threats of insurrection created by domestic factions. It's important to mention, however, that while Federalist number 9 is a paper in support of ratification of the Constitution, the first time that Hamilton addressed this issue was at the convention, when he was telling the delegates that neither the Virginia plan nor the New Jersey plan would work because they weren't strong enough. So in effect, what Hamilton has done is become an advocate of the Constitution during ratification, while at the convention he was doing everything he could do to modify the Virginia plan in order to create a stronger government than Madison believed was even possible. So I think there's no question there's a contradiction, if you will, in Hamilton. Because at the convention, he's telling the delegates that the Constitution won't work. It won't be strong enough. But once the Constitution comes out of the convention and goes to the states for ratification, Hamilton becomes an advocate for ratification of the Constitution. His conclusion is, it's not what I would have done, but it's the best thing we could get through that convention. And that's pretty much what Benjamin Franklin said on the last day of the convention. This Constitution is not perfect. All of us would see things in it we'd like to change. But Franklin said, it's the best we could come up with. We've been here 3 months. We've been here all summer long. What we need to do is put aside the things we would change and do everything we can do within our own states to get citizens to vote for this, by making them realize that it's either this or anarchy, civil war. The ratification of the Constitution of the United States, more than anything else, is presented to the voters in the context of, it may not be perfect, but it's the best we've got and we better do it, because if we don't, we're going to lose it all. Madison and Hamilton and Jay believe that in the face of that kind of a choice, the voters will go along. It turns out that it was darn close. In fact, in New York and in Virginia both, the majority of the delegates elected were opponents of the Constitution. So its supporters had to do some fast footwork in order to get positive votes for ratification from elected conventions, which the majority of whom were elected to defeat the Constitution. Thus, the idea of giving in to a Bill of Rights, promising people we'll add a Bill of Rights, we'll make amendments. And Madison himself believes that that's enough to put it over, and he's right. We are at 59 minutes after the hour. Why don't we pause and take a break, a 4 or 5 minute break? Then we'll come back, and I want you to hear Yates's notes on Hamilton's speech of June 18th within the context of the threat of insurrection and faction in America. This is important stuff. Please stay tuned. The Virtual Center will be right back.
Here's Dr. Bill O'Brien.
Bob Kincaid, thank you very much, and welcome to the Virtual Center for the Study of the U.S. Constitution and Civic Responsibility. If you are just joining us, welcome to today's program. If you have been with us throughout the entire program today, we thank you so very much for staying with us. Our phone number is area code 304-574-8178. That's 304-574-8178. My email address, if you'd like to communicate with me directly, waobrien906@gmail.com. That's waobrien906@gmail.com. Our theme has been domestic insurrection, what many today refer to as class warfare, the potential struggles between rich and poor, between those with property and those without it in the 18th century, and the extent to which that issue was a key factor in the Constitution of the United States, the way it was designed, the reasons it was approved, and the reasons that voters ratified it. As we mentioned at the end of our first hour, I'd like to go back to Hamilton's speech of June 18th. But whereas before we were looking at James Madison's notes of Hamilton's speech, I'd like to look at a portion of Hamilton's speech through the eyes of Robert Yates, his fellow delegate from New York, who was an anti-federalist, who was opposed to the Constitution, who arrived late to the Constitutional Convention and left early. His notes aren't as valuable as Madison's because he wasn't there for much of the convention, but he was there for Hamilton's speech. And because he was a fellow New Yorker with Hamilton, and because they differed on the Constitution of the United States, then what Yates takes down speech is a little bit different than what Madison. So what I'd like to do, if you bear with me, is share with you just the portion where Hamilton in his speech deals of domestic insurrection, issue that we looked at in paragraph of 9. If you remember Hamilton's speech, the first point, inadequacies of the Articles of Confederation, he looks at the Virginia plan into those inadequacies. Then he looks at the New plans to address those inadequacies as well. And as we pointed out when we looked at Madison's notes, Hamilton's conclusion is that neither one will do it. That's the point at which I'd like his notes. This verbatim, Robert Yates wrote down as spoken by Alexander Hamilton on June 18th, Constitutional Convention. Such are the insuperable objections be done. I am at a loss. I foresee the difficulty on a plan of drawing a from a continent. I think in our conversation with Bob Kincaid yesterday, Bob made the point. What can you have for a territory as large as the continent of the United States? It seems to suggest that those who were worried about the nature of a republic because of the extensive of the United States were making some sense. That was Bob's point yesterday. Hamilton goes on. What can be the inducements for gentlemen to come 600 miles to a national legislature? How are we going to get people to be willing to commit to this? The expense would at least amount to 100,000. I'm assuming that would be 100,000 pounds of shillings or something. This, however, can be no conclusive objection if it eventuates in an extinction of states' governments. Here's where Hamilton introduces the idea that while this government promises to be expensive, we can recoup some of the money by abolishing the states. He says, this, however, can be no conclusive objection if it eventuates in an extinction of state governments. The burden of the latter would be saved, and the expense then would not be great. State distinctions would be found unnecessary, and yet I confess to carry government to the extremities. The state governments reduced to corporations and with very limited powers might be necessary, and the expense of the national government would become less burdensome. So what Yates is dealing with, and Madison dealt with this in his notes on Hamilton's speech as well, what Hamilton is basically suggesting here is that we can partly offset the tremendous expense of national government over a territory this large by abolishing the state governments, the state apparatus of separate legislatures and separate governors and all the rest of it. But he admits, Hamilton admits, we're going to have to keep local governments in order to make sure that government reaches all the extremities, all the extremes of the nation. So we're going to have to keep something local. But they don't need to be the same power as the states now. They would be reduced to corporations with very limited powers. But on the other hand, they would be so much less expensive that would make the cost of the national government less burdensome. This is the paragraph that I wanted to bring to your attention. Yates goes on, "Yet I confess," now this is Hamilton speaking, of course, "Yet I confess I see great difficulty of drawing forth a good representation. What, for example, will be the inducements for gentlemen of fortune and abilities to leave their houses and businesses to attend annually and long?" So Hamilton is raising the question, in order to get good people, gentlemen of fortune and position and abilities, the people we got to have, in order to get them to come here, to man the new central government, what will be the inducements to leave their houses and their businesses and attend here for so long a period? It cannot be wages, Hamilton says, for these, I presume, must be small. Will not the power, therefore, be thrown into the hands of the demagogue or middling politician who, for the sake of a small stipend and the hopes of advancement, will offer himself as a candidate, and the real men of weight and influence, by remaining at home, add strength to the state governments? Hamilton presents a real issue here. This does not appear in Madison's notes of Hamilton's speech. What Hamilton raises here is the fact that we really run the risk of not attracting the best people as representatives, because wages are not going to be enough. They're going to be small, so money's not going to get them here. What Hamilton is afraid of is that if the best people don't come, demagogues, or what he calls middling politicians, will come, because they'll be attracted to the salaries even if they're small, and they'll be looking for advancement. They'll be looking to network. They'll be looking for advantage in the contacts they make, so they'll be willing to serve. What we're liable to end up with then is government manned not by the best people, but by ambitious, self-interested people who really have no interest at all in governing for the public interest. Consequently, what Hamilton is concerned about is we've got to find a way to get the best people here. We don't want the less than best, because the challenges are going to be so great. Not only that, but if the best people stay home, then their state governments are going to get the advantages of their talents, when in fact it's the national government that needs them. So again, back to Hamilton. I am at a loss to know what must be done. I despair that a Republican form of government can remove these difficulties. Whatever may be my opinion, I would hold it, however, unwise to change that form of government, even though I think Republican government as such is in danger. It would be my opinion that it wouldn't be a good move to change that form of government. We can't, the people will not accept anything but a republic. We need to face facts. So somehow we're going to have to deal with a Republican government, but we're going to have to structure it in such a way that it'll overcome the problems and the concerns we've talked about. He says, I would hold it, however, unwise to change that form of government. In other words, we can't tamper with republicanism. That's what our people are committed to. That's what they expect, and we better deliver. Hamilton says, I believe the British government forms the best model the world ever produced. And such has been its progress in the minds of the many that this truth gradually is gaining ground. People are beginning to recognize, in spite of the fact that we fought a war for independence against Great Britain, people more and more are beginning to recognize the beauty and the value of the British Constitution. It's the best that the world has ever seen. This government has for its object public strength and individual security. In other words, what makes the British government ideal is its ability to combine public strength and individual security. It's able to balance the freedom of the people with the need for order and security and strength in government. It is said with us to be unattainable. In other words, Hamilton is admitting that the word out there is that the British system for us is not possible, is unattainable. If it was once formed, he said, it would maintain itself. And then he says the following, and this is the part that I wanted you to concentrate on and reflect upon. If it was once formed, he said, it would maintain itself. And then he says the following. Remember, these are Robert Yates's notes. All communities divide themselves into the few and the many. The first are the rich and well-born. The other, the mass of the people. The voice of the people has been said to be the voice of God. And however generally this maxim has been quoted and believed, it is not true in fact. The people are turbulent and changing. They seldom judge or determine right. Give, therefore, to the first class a distinct, permanent share in the government. They will check the unsteadiness of the second, and as they cannot receive any advantage by a change, they therefore will ever maintain good government. That passage, to me, spoken to the Convention of Delegates drafting the Constitution of the United States, may be one of the most powerful statements of the extent to which the assembled delegates are confronting the realities of preserving order in the face of what has always been throughout history, Republican government confronted with internal insurrection and the back and forth balancing of tyranny on the one hand and anarchy on the other. The Constitution of the United States clearly was drafted with this in mind. Let me read that passage again. Alexander Hamilton. All communities divide themselves into the few and the many. The first are the rich and well-born, the few are the rich and well-born, the other, the mass of the people. The voice of the people has been said to be the voice of God. And however generally this maxim has been quoted and believed, it is not true in fact. The people are turbulent and changing. They seldom judge or determine right. Give therefore to the first class, to the few, a distinct, permanent share in the government. They will check the unsteadiness of the second, and as they cannot receive any advantage by a change, they therefore will ever maintain good government. What Hamilton is talking about here, is finding a way to connect the best people to the new government if you want to guarantee their support. We have to find a way to allow the best people an opportunity to benefit from the government. If they are benefiting by supporting the government, then they don't have anything to gain by changing it. Therefore, they will become the biggest, strongest supporters of government, and that's what we've got to have. If we want the right people to man this government, we're going to have to pay for it. We're going to have to find a way that it benefits these people to support and manage and participate in this government. I would suggest to you what Hamilton is inferring here is the constant relationship between government and the private sector. The reciprocal relationship between government and business, i.e., the positive connection between government and corporations, corporate America. If we want the right people to do the right thing, we have to make sure that it's in their interest to do that. Therefore, we have to create real opportunities for the best people to benefit from their support of this government. If you look at the program, the financial program that Hamilton creates in the Washington administration as Secretary of the Treasury, if you read his reports to Congress on debt and credit, you will find that Hamilton designs a financial program for the new nation which is designed to reward people for speculation and people's willingness to invest their private fortunes in the future of this country. Basically, what Hamilton says here is that even though we like to think in a republic that the voice of the people is the voice of God, let's be honest. And Hamilton is being honest with these delegates. No wonder when they left after he finished speaking and introduced his program, they adjourned for the day and just walked out without another word. Because Hamilton was laying it out in this speech. Hamilton's speech goes on, and these are the notes of Robert Yates. Can a democratic assembly, Hamilton says, who annually revolve in the mass of the people, be supposed steadily to pursue the public good? Hamilton is asking this question rhetorically. Can a democratic assembly who annually revolve in the mass of the people, in other words, annual elections, etc., can people who are elected democratically to serve for only 1 year, can this be expected to pursue the public good? Hamilton asks, nothing but a permanent body can check the imprudence of democracy. Their turbulent and uncontrolling disposition requires checks. This is the most blatant statement of social control and the extent to which these considerations were a factor in the structure of government created at Philadelphia by the Constitutional Convention that I've ever seen. Nothing but a permanent body can check the imprudence of democracy. Their turbulent and uncontrolling disposition requires checks. The Senate of New York, although chosen for 4 years, we have found to be inefficient. Will, on the Virginia plan, a continuance of 7 years do it? It is admitted that you cannot have a good executive upon a democratic plan. See the excellency of the British executive. He's placed above temptation. He can have no distinct interest from the public welfare. He's king for life. The king is the king in Great Britain. He has nothing to gain. There's no place else to go for him. So therefore, he'll always be concerned with the public interest, the public welfare first, because there's no benefit for him to do anything else. Nothing short of such an executive can be efficient, Hamilton says. The weak side of a Republican government is the danger of foreign influence. This is unavoidable unless it is so constructed as to bring forward its first characters in its support. I am therefore for a general government, yet would wish to go the full length of Republican principles, and then he lays out his proposal, the one that we looked at in Madison's note. One body of the legislature that would serve during good behavior for life, that would never have to run for election. One executive appointed who dares to execute his powers. Hamilton says it may be asked, is this Republican system? His answer, it is strictly so, as long as they remain elective. As long as the people can vote for somebody, it's a republic. What Hamilton is saying is it's a play on words. People are committed to a republic, we'll give them a republic. As long as they can participate, as long as they vote, it's a republic. But we need a president for life. We need one house of the legislature to serve for life. We need a court that serves for life. We need a central government that has the power to strike down state laws that it feels are inconsistent with the Constitution. And then Hamilton says, somebody's racing a car engine down the street. I apologize if you're picking that sound up. Let me observe, Hamilton says, that an executive is less dangerous to the liberties of the people when it's in office during life than for 7 years. A president that's there for life poses less of a threat to the freedom of the people than one that only serves for 7 years. And then he's going to go through and give reasons for that. He said, it may be said that this constitutes an elective monarchy. Pray, he says, what is a monarchy? May not the governors of the respective states be considered in that light? But by making the executive subject to impeachment, the term monarchy cannot apply. In other words, as long as people have a way to remove the executive by impeaching him, it's not a monarchy. As long as people can vote for something, it's a republic. In other words, what Hamilton is doing is laying out to the convention delegates exactly what the deal is. These elective monarchs, Hamilton says, have produced tumults in Rome and are equally dangerous to peace in Poland, but this cannot apply to the mode in which I would propose the election. Let the electors be appointed in each of the states to elect the executive. And then he goes through the rest of his plan. The assembly, the members of the House of Delegates, House of Representatives, so to speak, would be elected for 3 years. As we know, the Constitution changes that to 2. But the fact of the matter is the members of the Senate would be chosen for life. the executive to have the power of negativing all laws to make war or peace. The president has the power of veto over all laws and to remain in office during his life. The president makes all laws related to war and peace with the advice of the Senate, to make treaties with their advice, but to have the sole direction of all military operations, and to send ambassadors and appoint all military officers, and to pardon all offenders, treason excepted, unless by advice of the Senate. And then at the very end, Yates includes the line, I remember reading this once before here in the virtual center. His closing comments, and these are Yates's notes, are, I confess that this plan and that from Virginia are very remote from the idea of the people. Perhaps the New Jersey plan is nearest to their expectations. But the people are gradually ripening in their opinions of government. They begin to be tired of the excess of democracy. And what even is the Virginia plan but pork still with a little change of the sauce? In other words, he's criticizing the Virginia plan in this speech to the convention by saying it's a different sauce, but it's the same stuff. It's still pork. I would argue that Yates's notes on Hamilton's speech give us a flavor for exactly how serious Hamilton takes the threat of domestic insurrection and the need to control the people. He says straight up, people in this country believe that the voice of the people is the voice of God. And then he said, let's face it, folks, it ain't true. The people are turbulent and changing. They don't know what the heck they're doing. We can't rely on them. We've got to have the best people. We can't afford to have second class, the second best people, because they're demagogues and their priority is their own self-interest. We don't want them. We got to have the best people, the wealthiest, the most stable, the most visionary, the best educated. And in order to get them, we're going to have to buy it. We've got to construct government in such a way that these people derive benefit from serving in and supporting this government. I ask you to think about what is going on, what has been going on for so long in Washington. When these people lose elections, they end up as lobbyists for private corporations. They're able to use their contacts to engage in lucrative private business after they leave public office. It benefits them. People we know, the Clintons being a classic example, come into office as president and leave as multimillionaires. The Senate, our United States Senate, has been called a house of millionaires because the majority of members of the United States Senate are millionaires, many times over, most of them. All of this was envisioned by Alexander Hamilton. If I can, I just want to use this opportunity. We're at 33. We've just gone beyond the bottom of our second hour. So we've got the better part of a half hour left in today's program, and I want to get to something else in a moment. But if I can, let me just make a couple of concluding comments. What a day. We have looked at the vision and the foresight of James Madison in projecting population growth in the United States, which is going to require that the political system we create under the Constitution must be prepared to adapt to the democratic realities of coming generations. We have seen evidence today of just how visionary James Madison was. Now, we're looking at a speech by Alexander Hamilton in which Hamilton also is showing visionary signs in his recognition of blunt reality. You want this government to work? You better get the right people serving in it. You want to be able to get the right people serving in it? You got to make sure it's to their advantage to do so. You can believe all you want, Hamilton is saying, that the voice of the people is the voice of God. But the reality is we know that's not true. The people are turbulent and changing. They don't know what they want. They change from day to day. We've got to get people who have a vested interest in succeeding the most in this society, and we got to make sure that they're the ones who man the offices. If we do it, if we're able to do it, we can make this work. But, Hamilton says, if we start electing people for life and not giving the people the opportunity to vote for them every couple of years, isn't that monarchy? Is that still a republic? And Hamilton says, if the people can vote, it's a republic. If the people have a right to impeach the president for malfeasance in office, then it's really not a monarchy. It's an elected executive. So Hamilton has found a way to rationalize much of the concern that these delegates are going to hear in their efforts when they go home to their states to get the Constitution ratified. In my mind, there's absolutely no way that we can understand the structure and organization or the ratification of the Constitution of the United States unless we take very seriously these concerns. When I wrote, and I've mentioned this before, and I don't want to go into this because this is more about me than the subject. But when I wrote my dissertation on ratification of the Constitution in Maryland, this is exactly what I was proposing. That in Maryland, from the research that I did, those who supported the Constitution did so because it was the only way to make sure that the right people called the shots. The only way that you could guarantee that the right people called the shots is if you took power away from the state legislatures and moved it to the national level. As long as it was in the state, and as long as the legislative branch of government was the most powerful branch of government in the state, then power was too close to the people. Government was too susceptible to the demands and the pressures of the people. Representatives were too too much answerable, if you were, to instructions from their constituents. The idea was that in a Republican government, as it was conceived, the people could instruct their elected representative and tell them what they wanted him to do. And if he didn't do it, they would vote him out the next year. Consequently, the people ultimately are calling the shots. The only way to fix that is to take away local government's ability to respond. If you deny the states the power to print money, if you deny the states the power to interfere with private contracts, if you deny the states the power to involve themselves or intercede in any way in private debt, if you create a government that has a judicial system designed to force people to step up and pay their taxes and do what they're supposed to do and obey the law, the only way you're going to get that is from the national level. Because as long as the majority faction can organize, they will control what elected government does. Consequently, by moving power from the state level to the national level, you create the need for a much wider constituency in order to maintain the reality, the existence of a majority faction. As long as the majority cannot organize on a national basis, it does not have power. And if the majority is not governing, the minority is. This is the conclusion that a lot of folks don't want to reach. If you make majority rule impossible, you guarantee minority rule. And what Hamilton says in his June 18th speech is that that's exactly what we want. We want people to be able to participate. That's what makes it a republic. But we can't have a government in which the majority controls and instructs delegates and tells them what to do and how to vote. The reason for that, Hamilton says, because the people are turbulent and changing. They change their minds all the time. They don't know what they want. Their priorities are self-interest. We've got to have people who are willing to focus on the public interest. We've got to have the best people. And in order to get them, we're going to have to make it benefit them. It's going to have to be worth their while to give up a portion of their businesses and their lives and leave home in order to come and serve in this government. So the question is, if you have a government where the rules are being made by the few, government is being controlled by the few, then how do you create a sense of community? How do you keep everybody involved and everybody feeling like they matter? And that's where Madison talked in the previous letter we looked at today about expanding the suffrage and giving everybody the opportunity to participate in the laws under which they must live. Participate in the decisions of government without actually being able to dictate what those decisions are. That, I would suggest to you, is what these documents tell us. But more important, I would suggest, this, more than anything else, I believe, is the context within which the Constitution of the United States is designed, and ultimately, once it reaches the states, is ratified. Those people who are most supportive of ratification of the Constitution are the people who understand this, who see it, for whom it makes perfect sense. But the vast majority of the people don't understand this. The nature of the way we educate our citizens in terms of civic education never gives them the chance to confront the realities that the founders confronted. I think that it's a shame that citizens are not able to access this kind of information. I think they would come to the realization that the founders are a lot more credible and a lot more to be honored than they are. George Washington is important in this nation not because he cuts down cherry trees and but refuses to lie about it. George Washington and Madison and Jefferson and Hamilton and all the rest of them are insightful, well-educated, visionary, creative, committed people. They have a vision, they have ideals, and they were able to come up with a system which made it possible to bring these ideals to reality. As I've mentioned numerous times here at the Virtual Center, it is my fear that technology in the 21st century, cell phones and the internet and all the rest of it, is making it possible to bring the majority faction to fruition. I think that we have reached the point in America where the stability and security of the system that Madison and Hamilton created can no longer be relied upon, because we have people running for office and investing in elections all over the nation. We have nationally organized, well-financed, well-organized interest groups. We have people who are able to control the media. In fact, let's be honest, we have a media which to a large extent is reflective of corporate America. It is a corporate-controlled media. All of this, I would suggest to you, raises serious questions about the nature of the political system which Madison and the founders were able to create. Consequently, and we won't have time to pursue this last portion of this issue about class warfare or domestic insurrection or whatever you want to call it any further than we have, except to suggest that in order to get the people, the voters in the states, to buy into this Constitution once it's drafted, once it's created, requires an incredible public campaign, public advertising campaign, PR campaign, whatever you want to call it, political spin, advertising, promotion, use of the media, whatever you wanted to talk about. I would suggest to you that the threat of domestic insulation, the threat of domestic insurrection, the threat of violence, primarily promoted by the poor, is a major factor in getting the Constitution of the United States ratified. All of us know about Shays' Rebellion in the fall of 1786 and the spring of 1787. All of us know that only 5 states showed up at the Annapolis Convention in early September of 1786. But when the Philadelphia Convention met in May of 1787, 12 of the 13 states show up. There's absolutely no question that a major stimulus to bringing states to the reality that the Articles of Confederation had to be revised is Shays' Rebellion. And the realities of Shays-like rebellions in a number of other states. Not only did Shays' Rebellion occur in Massachusetts, but on September 20th, 1786, in Exeter, New Hampshire, New Hampshire farmers surrounded the legislature in Exeter and demanded paper money, demanded the abolition of all debts and all taxes, and demanded the equal distribution of property. Communism. The next day, the protesters were routed by the local militia. That was in New Hampshire. Like incidents occurred in Connecticut, Pennsylvania, South Carolina, North Carolina, and Virginia. So it wasn't only Massachusetts. It wasn't only Shays. Farmer insurrections against state governments were happening in many states. But the one that gets most of the attention is the one in Massachusetts, which is referred to as Shays' Rebellion. In effect, Daniel Shays was just one of several leaders of this. Luke Day, Eli Parsons, Adam Wheeler, these were some of the people that were in leadership positions. But the point I want to make is the extent to which those prominent citizens who advocated revision of the Articles of Confederation in the direction of the Constitution used the threat of Shays to frighten people into the reality that they had better support the Constitution or they were going to see insurrections and rebellions all around them. Evidence of this? On the 23rd of October, 1787, right after the Constitutional Convention ends, Henry Knox, 1786, this is before the convention, Henry Knox writes George Washington in Virginia about Shays' Rebellion. And he informs Washington that taxes were not the true cause of the rebellion. Knox explained to Washington that what he called the creed of the insurgents was that the property of the United States, quote, ought to be the common property of all, unquote, and that the insurgents were determined to annihilate all debts, public and private, and have agrarian laws which are easily affected by the means of unfunded paper money, which shall be a tender in all cases whatever. Knox predicted a formidable rebellion against reason, the principles of all government, and against the very name of liberty, unquote. To put this in a nutshell, Henry Knox scares the living hell out of George Washington about Shays' Rebellion. If you read this letter and then you read Washington's reaction to it, you begin to realize that Washington said, oh my God, we better do something. We better make this upcoming convention in the spring work. Let me read Knox's letter of October 23rd to George Washington again. Taxes are not the true cause of the rebellion in Massachusetts, Knox says. The true creed of the insurgents is that the property of the United States ought to be the common property of all. There shouldn't be private property at all. Everything ought to belong to everybody. And, Knox said, the insurgents were determined, quote, to annihilate all debts, public and private, and have agrarian laws which are easily affected by the means of unfunded paper money, which shall be a tender in all cases whatever. Knox predicted a formidable rebellion against reason, against the principle of all government and against the very name of liberty. Henry Lee of Virginia, who's directly influenced by Henry Knox, wrote to Washington that, quote, "We are all in dire apprehension that a beginning of anarchy with all its calamities has approached, and have no means to stop the dreadful work." He asked Washington to use his influence to intervene in Massachusetts in the face of Shays' Rebellion. And finally, we have 5 minutes left, so let me close the program with Washington's reaction. On the 31st of October, Washington writes to James Madison and says, quote, "We are fast verging to anarchy and confusion." He asked, "What stronger evidence can be given of the want of energy in our governments than these disorders in Massachusetts?" Washington thanked Knox for his letter and addressed what he called the vague and contradictory reports of the newspaper. And he says the following to Henry Knox: "When this spirit first dawned, probably it might easily have been checked, but it is scarcely within the reach of human ken at this moment to say when, where, or how it will end. There are combustibles in every state which a spark might set fire to." Unquote. This fear of Shays' Rebellion is not a fear of Shays. It's a fear of what Shays represented, namely the insurrection of the masses against wealth in America. What I am suggesting as we end this week's programming at the Virtual Center is that there is all sorts of evidence from the sources at the Constitutional Convention and throughout ratification that the fear of populist insurrection and the need to control the masses was a major factor in how the Constitution of the United States was designed, and was a major factor in getting it ratified. There's absolutely no question then that those who are most strong in their advocacy of the Constitution and its ratification are more than willing to use Shays' Rebellion and the other rebellions in several other states in order to promote fear among the general population. Fear of Shays' Rebellion, Washington says, there are like combustibles in other states which at any time a spark can set fire to. If you deal with the Constitution in that frame of mind, there's no way in the world that you are not going to vote for ratification. There's no way in the world you are not going to elect Federalists to the ratifying conventions. I think we can begin to see the tremendous challenge that anti-Federalists faced in trying to build opposition to ratification. Because the Federalists had access to the media, and they had Shays' Rebellion blown way out of control on their side. There's absolutely no question then that we're not talking about domestic insurrection as being an issue only in the Constitutional Convention. It was an issue in every state. It's what got leading, most prominent people in the states behind the Constitution, because its architects were making it very clear that the Constitution of the United States was the best answer that the convention could come up with to their concerns about domestic insurrection. I think that what is happening in Ferguson, Missouri, what has happened in Ferguson, Missouri, is but an indication that we have not yet totally solved this problem. My concern is we seem to be walking in the opposite direction from the directions we need to be taking in order to address these issues. We need to listen to Hamilton. We need to listen to Madison. We need not to create a second constitutional convention in order to amend the Constitution back into the 18th century when in fact it needs to be adapted, if at all, in preparation for the 21st century. We have reached the top of the hour. It's 3 o'clock. Our week is over. Thank you so much. Have a wonderful week. Be safe. Thank you.